The moment my father collapsed, the entire ballroom went silent. 1 second earlier, people had been laughing at me, at the woman whose younger sister had stolen her fiancé and turned it into the social event of the year in our little corner of Ohio. Then Daniel looked at his phone. His face lost all color. Vanessa grabbed his arm and whispered, "What's wrong?" He didn't answer. He just handed the phone to my mother. I will never forget the sound she made. Not a scream, not exactly. More like the sound somebody makes when the ground disappears underneath them. My father snatched the phone from her. 3 seconds later, he hit the floor beside the wedding cake. Champagne glasses shattered. Someone yelled for an ambulance. And in the middle of all that chaos, my sister looked at me with pure terror for the very first time in her life, because she finally understood something. I had stopped protecting them. But to explain how we got there, I have to go back long before the wedding. Long before Daniel. Back to the beginning. I grew up in a modest ranch house outside Columbus, Ohio, in a town where everybody knew everybody else's business before dinner. My father worked 32 years at a manufacturing plant making industrial valves. My mother taught Sunday school and spent most of her life worrying about appearances. We were the kind of family that looked normal from the outside. Inside was different. My younger sister Vanessa was born beautiful. I know that sounds cruel to say, but it was simply true. Blonde curls, bright smile. The kind of child strangers stopped grocery carts to compliment. I was quieter, taller, serious. By the time I was 10 years old, I already understood something about my place in the family. Vanessa was loved loudly. I was loved conditionally. Be patient with your sister. Let Vanessa have it. You're older, you should understand. That sentence shaped my entire life. You should understand. When Vanessa forgot homework, I helped her finish it. When she wrecked Mom's car at 17, my parents drained part of my college savings to fix it. When Dad had bypass surgery years later, I picked up extra nursing shifts to help cover medications while Vanessa posted beach photos from Florida with men whose names changed every 6 months. Nobody asked her to sacrifice. That was always my job. By 38, I had accepted that some women simply became dependable instead of cherished. I worked as a hospice nurse at a small private care facility outside town. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved it. Older people appreciate honesty. They can tell when somebody truly sees them. Most of my patients had learned painful lessons about family by the end of their lives. Funny thing is, I never imagined I'd become one of those lessons myself. I met Daniel Carter at a hardware store on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was trying to load bags of mulch into my trunk after work when he walked over and said, "Ma'am, either you're stronger than you look or you're too stubborn to ask for help." I laughed despite myself. He had kind eyes, calm voice, broad shoulders, the kind of steady confidence that feels safe when you're nearing 40 and tired of games. Daniel owned a local construction company, not huge but respected enough around town. For the first time in years, I felt noticed, not tolerated, not depended on, chosen. We dated for 11 months before he proposed during a quiet dinner at a lakeside restaurant. Nothing flashy, just sincerity. I cried so hard the waitress brought extra napkins. When I introduced him to my parents, they adored him instantly. Dad slapped him on the back like he'd gained a son. Mom started bragging to church friends before dessert was even served. And Vanessa smiled too brightly. "Oh my God," she said, staring at him over her wine glass. Evelyn finally found herself a good one. Something about the way she said it unsettled me, but I ignored it. That's what women like me do. We ignore warning signs because we're afraid happiness might disappear if we look too closely. At first, everything seemed fine. Daniel came to family barbecues. He helped Dad repair the back deck. Mom started introducing me differently. "This is our daughter Evelyn and her fiancé Daniel." For once, my name came second to something good. Then little things started changing. Vanessa began texting Daniel jokes. She sat too close to him during football games. At Thanksgiving, I walked into the kitchen and found them laughing quietly together while everyone else watched television. The moment I entered, silence dropped between them like a curtain. "You're paranoid," I told myself afterward. But deep down, something cold had already begun forming inside me. One Saturday afternoon, Mom and I were shopping for wedding decorations when she casually said, "You know, Vanessa always had an easier time connecting with men." I looked at her. "What does that mean?" She shrugged. "Nothing bad, just, you've always been more practical than romantic." Practical. That word again. Like I was some dependable appliance instead of a daughter. 3 months before the wedding, Daniel started working late more often. Vanessa suddenly became very interested in helping him with marketing ideas for his business. Dad kept saying how wonderful it was that the family was becoming so close. Then came the night everything shattered. I got off an overnight hospice shift early because one of my patients had passed peacefully around dawn. I remember driving home exhausted while listening to old country music on the radio. When I walked into my house, I heard laughter upstairs. Vanessa's laughter, then Daniel's voice. For one brief second, my brain tried protecting me. Maybe they're planning a surprise. Maybe. Then I opened the bedroom door. And there they were. My sister wrapped in my bedsheets. My fiancé standing beside her. Nobody spoke. Vanessa didn't even look ashamed at first. Just annoyed she'd been caught. Daniel finally whispered Evelyn. I remember dropping my overnight bag onto the floor. I remember hearing my own heartbeat. But mostly I remember what happened next. Not what they did. What my family did. Because when my mother arrived later that afternoon, she looked at Vanessa crying dramatically on the couch, then turned to me and said softly, maybe if you hadn't worked so much. I stared at her in disbelief. Dad rubbed his forehead and muttered, this situation's complicated. Complicated. My sister sleeping with my fiancé in my own bed was somehow complicated. Vanessa cried into Mom's shoulder and whispered, I didn't mean for this to happen. And my mother held her like she was the victim. 6 weeks later, their wedding invitations arrived in the mail, mine included. At the bottom, my mother had handwritten one sentence. Please don't make this harder than it already is. I almost didn't go to the wedding. For 3 straight weeks, the invitation sat unopened on my kitchen counter like a threat. Cream-colored cardstock, gold lettering, Vanessa Marie Carter and Daniel Brooks request the honor of your presence. My mother called every other day pretending nothing unforgivable had happened. People are talking, Evelyn, as if I'm the one who slept with my sister's fiancé. A long silence would follow that. Then she'd sigh dramatically. You know what I mean? I did know what she meant. In small towns, appearances become more important than truth. People would rather maintain peace than confront ugliness directly, especially older church-going families like ours. At Sunday services, women who had known me since childhood squeezed my hand and said things like, God calls us to forgiveness. Funny how forgiveness is usually demanded from the wounded person, never the one holding the knife. I stopped attending church after that. I still believed in God. I just couldn't stomach the audience anymore. The weeks before the wedding became a strange kind of public humiliation. Grocery store whispers, side glances at the pharmacy, people pretending not to stare. Meanwhile, Vanessa leaned into the attention like she was starring in a Hallmark movie. She posted engagement photos online every few days, pumpkin patch pictures, wine tasting pictures, pictures in my favorite restaurant. Sometimes I'd catch myself studying her smile, trying to understand how someone could betray you completely and still sleep peacefully at night. Then again, Vanessa had been trained her whole life to believe consequences belonged to other people. Mine usually. I buried myself in work. Hospice nursing leaves little room for self-pity because somebody is always hurting more than you are. I spent my days helping elderly patients bathe, eat, remember medications, and sometimes simply feel less alone while dying. That's where I met Margaret Holloway. Margaret was 78 years old, sharp as a razor, and richer than anyone would have guessed from the way she dressed. Her late husband had owned a large construction supply business across central Ohio years earlier. The first time she saw my engagement ring missing, she asked, man leave or man die? I laughed despite myself. Left. Ah, she said knowingly. Those are usually the expensive ones. Margaret had a way of speaking plainly that reminded me of older Americans from another generation. Less performance, more truth. Over time, she became my favorite patient. One rainy afternoon, while I adjusted her oxygen tubing, she studied my face carefully and asked, you still love him? The question caught me off guard. I don't know anymore. That means yes. I sat beside her bed quietly. Then I admitted everything. The affair. The wedding. My family choosing Vanessa again. Margaret listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she looked out the window for a long moment before saying something that stayed with me. People who betray others rarely stop at one betrayal. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? What's the man's full name? Daniel Brooks. Her expression changed immediately. Not dramatically. Just enough. You said construction. Yes. Margaret leaned back slowly in her chair. Well now, she murmured, that's interesting. A cold feeling moved through me. Margaret explained that years earlier Daniel had briefly worked for her husband's company before suddenly disappearing. Why'd he leave? They never told employees officially, she said. But my husband believed money was missing. I stared at her. Are you saying Daniel stole from them? Margaret shrugged carefully. I'm saying your fiancé's name caused arguments in my house 15 years ago. Former fiancé, I almost corrected. But somehow the words still hurt too much. That conversation should have ended there. Instead, it planted a seed. After that, little things started bothering me more deeply. Daniel suddenly drove a newer truck, despite complaining about cash flow months earlier. Vanessa kept bragging about future investments. My father started talking excitedly about Daniel helping manage retirement money. One night during dinner at my parents' house, Dad proudly said Daniel understands business better than I ever did. I nearly dropped my fork. You're giving him financial information. Mom immediately snapped, "Don't start." I'm not starting anything. I'm asking a question. Vanessa rolled her eyes dramatically. You're obsessed. Obsessed. Not heartbroken. Not betrayed. Obsessed. Dad awkwardly changed the subject while Daniel gave me one long, unreadable look across the table. That was the first moment I realized he might actually fear me. A few days later, my mother called asking if I could help arrange flowers for the wedding reception. I honestly thought I'd misunderstood her. You want me to help decorate the wedding between my sister and my ex-fiancé? You've always been better at these things than Vanessa. There it was again. Usefulness over humanity. I told her no. She cried. Not because of what happened to me. Because people might judge the family if I refused. Later that week, Vanessa showed up at my apartment, unexpectedly carrying coffee like we were still sisters. She walked around my living room casually before saying, "Mom said you're being difficult." I laughed out loud. "You slept with my fiancé." She crossed her arms. "Daniel and I are in love." "You mean you won?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Something flashed in her expression then. Victory mixed with guilt. But only for a second. Before leaving, she paused near the door and said, "Can I borrow Grandma's pearl earrings for the wedding? Mom says you still have them." I stared at her in disbelief. Those earrings had belonged to our grandmother before she died of cancer. She left them specifically to me because, in her words, "You're the only one who understands sentimental things." "No," I said quietly. Vanessa's face hardened instantly. "You always have to make everything emotional." And there it was. The Carter family philosophy in one sentence. The problem was never betrayal. The problem was my reaction to betrayal. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment for almost an hour before opening my laptop. I'm not proud of what happened next. But pain changes people. I started searching public business records connected to Daniel's construction company. At first, I found nothing unusual. Permits, property records, subcontractor filings, then small inconsistencies appeared. Repeated vendor names, payments to companies without real addresses, missing tax details. My nursing job had made me detail-oriented over the years. Elder abuse often hides inside paperwork. And suddenly my instincts began screaming. Night after night I kept digging. By the week before the wedding, I found enough irregularities to scare me. Then I opened one scanned document that made my blood run cold. At the bottom sat my father's signature, except it wasn't really his. I knew my father's handwriting, and somebody had forged it. Above the signature line were words I could barely process. Retirement investment transfer authorization. Amount $187,000. Beneficiary Brooks Development Solutions, LLC. I stopped breathing for a moment. Then I saw the date. It had been signed 3 weeks earlier. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday afternoon in early October. Ohio autumn had just started turning the trees copper and gold, and the country club outside Columbus looked like something from a magazine spread. White roses lined the outdoor aisle. Crystal chandeliers glowed through the ballroom windows. Somebody had spent an enormous amount of money trying to create the appearance of perfection. That somebody was mostly my father. As I parked my old Honda near rows of luxury SUVs and polished sedans, I sat gripping the steering wheel for almost 2 full minutes. Part of me still wanted to leave, but another part of me needed to see it through. Needed them to look me in the eye. I wore a dark blue dress, simple enough not to attract attention. No dramatic entrance, no revenge fantasy, just quiet dignity. The moment I walked inside the venue, conversations shifted. Not stopped completely, just softened. People glanced at me over champagne glasses and quickly looked away. Small-town curiosity is rarely subtle. An older woman from church approached carefully and touched my arm. "You're very brave for coming, Evelyn." I smiled politely. "Thank you." What I wanted to say was, "No, I'm just tired of disappearing for other people's comfort." The ceremony itself felt surreal. I sat alone near the back while Vanessa floated down the aisle in a fitted ivory gown that probably cost more than my car. My mother cried loudly enough for several rows to hear. Daniel kept his eyes fixed forward almost the entire time. Not once did he look at me. That bothered me more than if he had. Cowards avoid mirrors. During the vows, Vanessa laughed softly while placing the ring on his finger like she'd won some long competition. Maybe in her mind she had, People applauded when the officiant announced them husband and wife. I clapped too, slowly, calmly. You reach a strange kind of peace after enough betrayal. Not forgiveness exactly, more like emotional exhaustion. The reception moved into the ballroom afterward. Country music played softly through speakers while guests drank bourbon and danced beneath hanging lights. Everywhere I looked, I saw people trying too hard to pretend this situation wasn't ugly. My cousins avoided eye contact. My father kept overcompensating with forced laughter. My mother floated from table to table, performing happiness like an actress afraid the audience might notice cracks in the script. And Vanessa glowed. She loved attention the way some people need oxygen. At one point, she passed my table and paused just long enough to whisper, "Thanks for not causing a scene." I looked up at her. "You're welcome." Something about my tone unsettled her slightly. Good. By dessert, most guests were tipsy enough to relax. That's when my mother stood to make her toast. She tapped her champagne glass dramatically until the room quieted. I just want to say she began warmly that sometimes life surprises us. Nervous laughter spread through the crowd. Mom smiled toward Vanessa and Daniel. And sometimes, she continued, people end up exactly where they belong. A few guests clapped awkwardly. Then she looked directly at my sister and raised her glass. She finally won. The room exploded with laughter. Not everyone, but enough. Enough for humiliation to move through my body like heat. I saw one of my cousins lower her eyes immediately in embarrassment. I saw Daniel force a smile. And I saw Vanessa absolutely glowing with triumph. For a brief second, the old version of me almost surfaced. The woman who would swallow pain quietly. The woman who would go home and cry alone. But that woman had died the morning I opened my bedroom door 3 months earlier. So instead, I smiled calmly. Then Daniel's phone buzzed. At first, he ignored it. The room was still chuckling from my mother's little joke. Then the phone buzzed again. Annoyed, Daniel pulled it from his pocket and glanced down casually. I watched the exact moment his expression changed. Confusion first, then disbelief, then pure terror. All color drained from his face so quickly it honestly frightened me. Vanessa leaned toward him. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His hands started shaking. The ballroom gradually quieted as people noticed something was wrong. "Daniel," my father asked. Slowly, Daniel stood from his chair. He looked directly at me for the first time all day. And in his eyes I finally saw it. Fear. Real fear. Without speaking, he turned the phone toward Vanessa. I watched her smile disappear while reading the screen. "No," she whispered instantly. "No, no, no." My mother grabbed the phone next. The sound she made barely seemed human. Dad stood quickly and snatched it from her. 3 seconds later, he collapsed onto the floor beside the wedding cake. Everything exploded after that. Women screamed. Chairs scraped violently across the ballroom. Someone yelled for an ambulance while guests crowded around my father. Champagne glasses shattered against the dance floor. Vanessa grabbed Daniel's jacket frantically. "What did you do?" she screamed. "I didn't know she had this." That sentence changed everything. Not, "It isn't true." Not, "She's lying." Just, "I didn't know she had this." Several guests heard him, including my mother. I stayed seated through all of it. Calm, still. Because after months of humiliation, I finally understood something older people often learn too late. Silence protects the guilty, not the wounded. The message on Daniel's phone had come from an anonymous email account I created 2 nights earlier. Attached were 27 scanned documents, bank transfers, forged signatures, fake vendor payments, shell companies, and one devastating summary page explaining everything clearly enough for even a panicked wedding guest to understand. Daniel had been slowly draining money from elderly investors through fraudulent construction partnerships. My father was one of them. But worse than that, Vanessa knew pieces of it already. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to ignore obvious warning signs because she liked the lifestyle Daniel promised. Luxury trips, a bigger house, financial security. The same selfish blindness that had followed her since childhood finally caught up with her. My father groaned weakly on the floor while paramedics rushed inside. Mom kept crying. How could this happen? But nobody answered her, because deep down we all knew exactly how it happened. Years of favoritism. Years of looking away. Years of rewarding charm over character. One of Daniel's business partners suddenly disappeared from the reception entirely. Another guest quietly walked outside, making a phone call I suspected was to police. The illusion had shattered too publicly to survive. Vanessa turned toward me, finally, mascara running down her face. "You did this." Her voice sounded small, broken. I met her eyes evenly. "No," I said quietly, "you all did." Then I stood, picked up my purse, and walked calmly toward the ballroom exit. Nobody stopped me. Not my mother. Not my sister. Not even my father, as paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher. For the first time in my entire life, my family wasn't asking me to stay and clean up the mess. They were too busy facing their own. By Monday morning, everybody in Fairfield County knew what happened at the wedding. Not the polished version my mother would have preferred. The real version. In small-town Ohio, scandals travel faster than weather reports, especially when wealthy guests film half the disaster on their phones before the ambulance even arrives. I woke up the morning after the wedding expecting to feel victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Just deeply, painfully tired. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones after years of carrying things nobody else notices. I made coffee in silence and stood at my kitchen window watching rain drip from the maple tree outside my apartment complex. For the first time in months, nobody was texting me accusations or demanding explanations. My phone simply sat there, quiet. Around 9:30, it started ringing. Not family. Reporters. Apparently, one of the wedding guests had uploaded a short video online showing my father collapsing beside the cake while people screamed in the background. Another clip showed Vanessa crying while Daniel argued with one of his business associates near the ballroom doors. The town ate it alive. I ignored every call. Then my mother called. 7 times. I finally answered on the 8th. "Your father's home from the hospital," she said immediately, voice hoarse from crying. "Is he okay?" "He's resting." A long silence stretched between us. Then she whispered, "How long have you known?" "Long enough. You humiliated us." That sentence hit me harder than it should have. Not Daniel stole from us. Not Vanessa lied to us. Not we hurt you. Just you embarrassed the family. I closed my eyes. "Mom, he stole nearly $200,000 from Dad. He was going to fix it." I actually laughed then. Not because it was funny, because the denial sounded so desperate it barely resembled reality anymore. Did Vanessa know? My mother hesitated too long. That was answer enough. After hanging up, I drove to work feeling older than 40. Hospice care has a strange way of keeping life honest. Nobody there cared about country club scandals or family reputations. People were worried about cancer treatments, oxygen levels, pain management, and whether they'd live long enough to see Christmas. Real things. Margaret was sitting upright in bed reading when I entered her room. Without lowering the newspaper, she said, "Well, sounds like your family had themselves a memorable reception." I sighed. It's everywhere already. Honey, half the women at church are pretending to pray for you while enjoying every detail. That made me smile despite myself. Margaret folded the newspaper carefully and studied me over her glasses. "You don't look happy." I thought I would be. And I sat slowly in the chair beside her bed. "I feel guilty." "About what?" "My father collapsed." Margaret snorted softly. "Your father collapsed because a lifetime of bad decisions finally landed on his chest all at once." I looked down at my hands. I didn't want to destroy them. "No," she said gently. "You wanted the truth to stop destroying you." That stayed with me the rest of the day. Meanwhile, the investigation around Daniel escalated quickly. By Wednesday afternoon, local police and state investigators had formally opened fraud inquiries tied to his construction business. Several elderly clients came forward claiming confusing investment agreements and missing funds. One man lost nearly $80,000 from retirement savings. An older widow reportedly signed documents she barely understood after Daniel promised home renovation partnerships that never existed. The deeper authorities looked, the uglier everything became. And suddenly the town's sympathy shifted. Not toward Vanessa. Toward me. People who barely acknowledged me before now stopped me at grocery stores. A retired teacher hugged me near the produce section and whispered, "You were brave." An elderly man whose wife I once cared for at hospice squeezed my shoulder and said, "You protected your daddy even after what they did to you." That one nearly broke me, because despite everything I had tried to protect him, even now, especially now, at work, Margaret watched me carefully over the next few days. "You still love your family," she observed one afternoon. I laughed bitterly. I'm not sure why. Because decent people don't stop loving overnight. She reached for her tea slowly. Truth feels cruel only when lies have lived comfortably for too long. Older people say things like that sometimes. Quiet sentences that settle into your soul for years. Friday night, someone knocked on my apartment door close to 11. I almost ignored it. But when I checked the peephole, my stomach tightened. Vanessa. She looked awful. Not glamorous. Not polished. Just exhausted. Mascara smeared. Hair tied back carelessly. Oversized sweatshirt instead of designer clothes. For the first time since childhood, she looked human to me. I opened the door halfway. "What do you want?" She swallowed hard. "Can I come in?" Every instinct told me no, but I stepped aside anyway. Vanessa entered slowly, like she didn't recognize the apartment anymore. Maybe she didn't. She'd always visited this place with superiority before. Now she looked almost frightened. I stayed standing while she sat on the edge of the couch, twisting her fingers together nervously. They froze his accounts, she said quietly. I said nothing. He's saying people misunderstood everything. Again, silence. Then she looked up suddenly, eyes red from crying. You really think I knew all of it? I met her stare evenly. I think you ignored whatever threatened your happiness. That's not fair. I almost laughed. Fair? Her face tightened. You always act like you're morally better than everybody else. No, I said calmly. I act like actions matter. For a second she looked furious. Then something inside her cracked. You have no idea what he was like privately, she whispered. I frowned slightly. Vanessa wiped her face angrily. At first he made me feel special. Then slowly. Everything became competition. Between us. Between me and you. Between me and Mom. He always wanted somebody insecure. That caught my attention. He told me you secretly looked down on me, she continued quietly. That you thought I was shallow. That Mom only loved me because I was easier. I closed my eyes briefly. Classic manipulation. Separate people emotionally so nobody compares stories. He said you were jealous because men naturally wanted me more. The sad thing was a younger version of Vanessa probably needed to believe that. Because our parents had built her identity around being adored instead of being accountable. She looked around my apartment shakily. I know you hate me. Hate takes energy, I replied softly. I'm just tired. Tears filled her eyes again. Then she asked the one question I think truly mattered. Was any of it real between us? I looked at my little sister sitting there broken on my couch and remembered braiding her hair before elementary school, teaching her how to drive, holding her hand during thunderstorms when we were children. Yes, I whispered honestly. That's why this hurt so much. Vanessa started crying quietly into her hands. But even then I couldn't comfort her. Not yet. Some wounds need honesty before healing. And our family was only beginning to understand how deep the damage really went. I didn't see my father for almost 2 weeks after the wedding. Part of that was practical. He was recovering from what doctors called a cardiac stress episode, though everyone in town simply referred to it as the collapse. The other part was emotional. I wasn't ready. And honestly, I don't think he was either. During those weeks, the investigation against Daniel grew uglier by the day. Local news stations picked up the story after state authorities confirmed multiple elderly fraud victims across 3 counties. The details made me sick. Retirement accounts drained. Forged signatures. Confusing investment contracts targeting older homeowners who trusted him because he spoke confidently and dressed professionally. One 74-year-old widower told reporters he treated me like family. That sentence haunted me, because predators always understand something decent people forget. Trust is easier to steal than money. Daniel was arrested on a Thursday morning outside a downtown attorney's office in Columbus. Somebody sent me the news article before noon. I stared at his booking photo for a long time. He looked older already. Smaller somehow. Not powerful. Just weak. Funny how truth changes a face. Vanessa moved out of the townhouse they'd rented together almost immediately after the arrest. I heard she was staying temporarily with a friend from high school because my mother refused to let her return home while reporters kept circling the neighborhood. Even now, appearances still mattered to Mom. Some habits survive almost anything. One rainy afternoon, my father finally called me himself. Not Mom speaking for him. Not a group message. Him. His voice sounded thinner than I remembered. Would you come by? I almost said no. Not out of cruelty. Self-protection. But something in his tone stopped me. So the next morning I drove to the house I grew up in. The same beige ranch home with the cracked driveway Dad always promised to reseal every summer. Walking inside felt strange, familiar but colder somehow. Mom was in the kitchen pretending to organize mail she clearly hadn't touched. She looked older in just a few weeks. Guilt ages people quickly. He's in the den, she said quietly. No dramatics, no accusations. Just exhaustion. I found Dad sitting in his recliner beside the window wrapped in an old Ohio State blanket despite the mild weather. For the first time in my life he looked fragile to me. Not physically. Emotionally. He muted the television when I entered. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he said softly, "You look tired." I almost laughed. "So do you." A tiny smile crossed his face before disappearing again. I sat across from him while rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally he exhaled heavily and said the words I never truly expected to hear. "I failed you." Just like that. No excuses attached. No conditions. I felt my throat tighten immediately. Dad stared down at his hands. When you're young, he began quietly, you think favoritism means loving one child more. He swallowed hard. But sometimes it means expecting one child to survive everything. I didn't speak. Because if I opened my mouth too soon, years of buried hurt might come out all at once. Dad rubbed his forehead slowly. After your grandmother died, your mother fell apart for a while. You were only 14, but suddenly you started helping around the house. Cooking, paying attention to bills, taking care of Vanessa. I remembered. Back then, everyone called me mature for my age. Nobody realized maturity in children often comes from emotional necessity. Dad's voice grew rougher. You became dependable. So dependable that we stopped noticing how much we asked from you. Tears burned behind my eyes. And Vanessa? He sighed deeply. She was emotional, sensitive, easier to upset. So you protected her? Yes. The honesty of it hurt worse than denial somehow. Dad looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. We kept telling ourselves you didn't need protecting. Something inside me finally cracked then. Not dramatically, quietly, like ice breaking beneath pressure. I did need it, I whispered. Dad closed his eyes. I know. Years of pain rose inside me so fast I couldn't stop it anymore. You let her take everything I said shakily, every single time. Dad stayed silent. She wrecked cars, ruined relationships, borrowed money, lied constantly, and somehow I always became the problem when I reacted. My voice grew stronger. When Daniel cheated on me, Mom practically blamed my work schedule. Dad looked ashamed. I know. No, you don't, I snapped suddenly. Do you know what it felt like sitting at that wedding while everybody laughed at me? His face crumpled. You think I exposed Daniel because I wanted revenge, I continued. I exposed him because none of you were ever going to stop him. You trusted him more than me. Dad's eyes filled with tears. Real tears, not performative ones, old man tears that come from finally seeing damage too late. I thought you were stronger, he whispered. I wiped my face angrily. That's what everybody says right before they ask you to suffer quietly. Silence filled the room, heavy silence. The kind families avoid for decades because truth feels dangerous once lying becomes tradition. Then something unexpected happened. My mother started crying in the hallway. I hadn't realized she'd been listening. She walked slowly into the den, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. No makeup, no church smile, no performance. Just a tired 70-year-old woman realizing her family had rotted from the inside while she worried about appearances. I didn't know how lonely you were, she whispered. That nearly destroyed me. Because she should have known. A mother should know. But some parents become so focused on managing peace that they stop noticing who pays for it emotionally. I looked away before answering. You never asked. Mom covered her mouth and cried harder. For once, nobody rushed to comfort her. Not me. Not Dad. The truth simply sat there between us. Raw and unavoidable. A few days later, Vanessa came by my apartment again. This time, she carried a small velvet jewelry box. Without speaking, she handed it to me. Grandma's pearl earrings. I opened the box slowly. For a second, memories flooded back so strongly it hurt. Christmas dinners. Grandma teaching me pie recipes. Her perfume. Her laugh. Vanessa stood awkwardly near the door. I should have given these back before she said quietly. I nodded. Neither of us knew how to rebuild years of damage yet. But for the first time in our lives, she wasn't trying to win. And maybe that mattered more than either of us realized. 1 year later, I stood in front of a room full of senior citizens holding a stack of pamphlets titled Protecting Yourself from Financial Fraud. Funny how life changes. The community center in Lancaster smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, and about 40 retirees sat in folding chairs listening carefully while I explained warning signs of financial manipulation. Never sign documents you don't fully understand, I told them gently, and never feel embarrassed about asking questions. Good people count on your trust, bad people count on your silence. Several heads nodded. One elderly man raised his hand and asked, "What if the person's family?" The room went quiet. I paused before answering. Sometimes trust feels safest when it comes from people close to us, I said carefully. But that's exactly why we have to stay honest with each other. That answer came from experience more than training. After Daniel's arrest, investigators uncovered fraud involving nearly a dozen victims across central Ohio. Some lost small amounts. Others lost everything they'd spent decades saving. The judge sentenced Daniel to 9 years in prison for fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation. When I heard the sentence, I didn't celebrate. I just sat quietly in my car outside the courthouse and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. Because by then revenge no longer felt satisfying, only sad. Daniel had destroyed lives chasing status and control. And somewhere along the way, my family helped create the perfect environment for someone like him to thrive. charm rewarded, accountability avoided, truth delayed until disaster forced it into daylight. Vanessa spent months unraveling emotionally after the trial. At first, people in town treated her cruelly. Some called her stupid, others called her greedy. A few simply stopped speaking to her altogether. But shame can either harden a person or humble them. To her credit, Vanessa chose humility. She started working 2 jobs, one at a dental office reception desk, and another helping evenings at a local boutique downtown. She sold most of the expensive things Daniel had bought her voluntarily. No dramatic speeches, no social media apologies. Just quiet accountability. Eventually, she began attending counseling through a church support program. One afternoon over coffee, she admitted something I'd suspected for years. I spent my whole life thinking attention meant love. I looked at her carefully across the diner booth. That wasn't entirely your fault. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. Because deep down, both of us understood something painful. Children build identities from whatever their parents reward most. And our parents had rewarded performance over character for a very long time. Mom and Dad changed too. Not overnight. Older people rarely change quickly. Habits built over decades settle deep into the bones. But slowly, honestly, they changed. After the scandal, they sold the big house and moved into a smaller retirement community outside Newark. Dad admitted they couldn't emotionally handle maintaining appearances anymore. Too many memories in that house, he told me one afternoon. Some good, some painful. Mom stopped pretending everything was fine all the time. That may sound small, but for her it was enormous. Sometimes she even apologized directly now. The first time she did it sincerely, we were folding laundry together in her apartment while an old Frank Sinatra song played softly on the radio. She handed me a towel and quietly said I should have protected you more. I looked down at the towel in my hands because hearing those words at 40 years old still made me emotional. I know, I whispered. Neither of us cried dramatically. Healing at our age doesn't usually look dramatic. It looks like honesty, repeated consistently. Margaret passed away that spring. Peacefully. I was there holding her hand. Right before the end, she smiled weakly and said, "You finally stopped carrying everybody else's sins." Then she closed her eyes and slipped away quietly. A week later, her attorney contacted me. Margaret had left me something in her will, not money. A handwritten letter. I still keep it in my bedside drawer. One line from it stays with me every day. The strongest people are not the ones who destroy families. They are the ones who stop the damage from spreading. For a long time, I thought exposing Daniel had been my revenge story. But looking back now, I realize it was really the beginning of our family finally telling the truth. And truth, even painful truth, can sometimes save what's left. Last Thanksgiving, all 4 of us sat together again for the first time since the wedding disaster. Nothing looked like it used to. Vanessa was quieter. Mom no longer forced fake cheerfulness every 5 minutes. Dad moved slower after the heart episode. And me, I stopped shrinking myself to keep everyone else comfortable. That may have been the biggest change of all. Dinner wasn't perfect. There were awkward silences. Old wounds still floated near the surface sometimes. But nobody lied anymore. That mattered. At one point, Dad looked around the table softly and said, "Families don't fall apart all at once." We all listened. "They fall apart little by little," he continued, "every time honesty gets traded for comfort." Nobody argued with him, because we had lived it. Later that evening, after dishes were cleared and leftovers packed away, Vanessa helped me put coats near the door. Before I left, she touched my arm gently. "I really am sorry," she whispered. This time I believed her, not because words erase betrayal, but because changed behavior tells the truth words can't. As I drove home through quiet Ohio streets glowing with Christmas lights, I realized something surprising. I no longer wanted anyone to lose. Not my sister, not my parents, not even myself. I simply wanted the hurting to stop. And maybe that's what forgiveness really becomes when you get older. Not forgetting, not excusing, just refusing to let pain keep poisoning what years you still have left. If this story touched you in some way, if you've ever felt overlooked, betrayed, or quietly burdened inside your own family, I hope you remember this. Your kindness should never require your silence. And sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is finally tell the truth. Thank you for listening to my story. If it meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need it too.